3,000 years ago, in the limestone caves that honeycomb the Judean wilderness, something extraordinary was taking shape. Picture, if you will, a shepherd boy, barely more than a child, pressed against cold stone walls while soldiers searched the valleys below. His name was David, and in those moments of terror, he was discovering something that would outlive empires, outlast civilizations, and speak to human hearts across the millennia. The wind howls through the cave mouth, carrying with it the distant sounds of pursuit. Yet David does not simply cower. Instead, he reaches for his harp, a simple instrument of wood and sinew, and begins to pluck out melodies that seem to emerge from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. The notes hang in the air, 8 vibrations per second, a frequency that modern neuroscience would later identify as the precise threshold between waking and sleeping consciousness. Consider what was happening in that cave. A terrified young man, facing death at any moment, was unconsciously tapping into rhythms that mirror the deepest patterns of human awareness. Those 8 Hz vibrations, the same frequency produced by his harp strings, correspond exactly to theta brainwaves, the state that bridges our conscious and unconscious minds. David was not merely making music. He was encoding a technology of comfort, born from necessity, carved from the raw material of human extremity. But David was not alone in this remarkable discovery. Across the ancient world, other poets were uncovering similar secrets hidden in the architecture of sound and rhythm. In the temple courts of Jerusalem, a musician named Asaph would watch the evening sacrifice, a smoke rise in spiraling columns, its movement perfectly matching the meter of verses he was composing. The smoke itself became his metronome, teaching him rhythms that would later calm anxious hearts across centuries. Meanwhile, beside the thundering waterfalls of the Jordan Valley, the sons of Korah, a guild of temple musicians, were making their own extraordinary breakthrough. They discovered that white noise, the sound of rushing water cascading over rocks, could be encoded into Hebrew meter. When spoken aloud, their verses recreated the same neural effect as standing beside those ancient falls, a phenomenon that modern sleep researchers now recognize as one of nature's most powerful relaxation triggers. Each psalm that emerged from this tradition carried within it the fingerprint of human extremity. Warriors composed verses in the hours before battle, when adrenaline coursed through their veins and sleep seemed impossible. Mothers whispered words over sick children during long night vigils, their breath patterns unconsciously shaping the rhythm of comfort. Prisoners in Babylonian exile, far from their homeland, created verses that carried the essence of peace across impossible distances. What these ancient poets had stumbled upon was nothing less than a biological technology, words and rhythms that could physically alter human consciousness. They had no understanding of neurotransmitters or brainwave patterns, yet their compositions worked with surgical precision on the human nervous system. The Psalms were becoming a living organism, growing and adapting as they passed from voice to voice, generation to generation. As the tradition developed, temple scribes began adding mysterious notations to the text's markings they called Selah. These weren't mere musical instructions, they were neurological interventions, precisely placed pauses that forced the mind to rest between thoughts. When you encounter Selah in an ancient psalm, you are meeting a 3,000-year-old understanding of how consciousness works, how the brain requires strategic emptiness to process meaning deeply. The shepherd boy in that cave could never have imagined what he was setting in motion. His harp, vibrating at 8 Hz in the darkness, was creating patterns that would eventually be studied in university laboratories, analyzed by quantum physicists, and prescribed by medical doctors. Yet the power lay not in complexity, but in simplicity, in the recognition that human beings, despite all our technological advancement, still operate according to rhythms as old as our species itself. Night after night, David refined his compositions, testing which combinations of words and sounds could transform terror into tranquility. He discovered that certain phrases, when repeated in specific patterns, created what we might now call cognitive loops, mental pathways that led inevitably toward rest. The Hebrew language itself seemed designed for this purpose, with its abundance of vowel-consonant alternations creating natural breathing rhythms when spoken aloud. But perhaps most remarkably, David was learning that words carried more than meaning. They carried the accumulated experience of everyone who had ever spoken them. Each time a frightened person whispered his verses in darkness, those words absorbed a trace of their comfort, building layer upon layer of peace like sediment in an ancient riverbed. The Psalms were becoming repositories of human tranquility, growing more powerful with each voice that gave them life. As dawn broke over the Judean hills, illuminating the cave where David sheltered, something unprecedented had occurred in human history. Poetry had been transformed into medicine, words had become technology, and the bridge between waking and sleeping consciousness had been mapped in Hebrew verse, creating pathways that would guide billions of souls toward rest. The soldiers below were searching for a fugitive king, but what they failed to capture was far more valuable than any crown or throne. In that limestone cave, vibrating with 8 Hz frequencies, the future of human sleep had been composed. The melodies that echoed off those ancient walls would travel through time itself, adapting to every culture, surviving every catastrophe, and speaking the same message of comfort to a Persian exile as to a modern insomniac staring at the ceiling in the small hours of the night. David could not have known that his desperate compositions would one day be studied in Harvard laboratories, analyzed by artificial intelligence, and prescribed by sleep specialists. He could not have foreseen brain scanners documenting how his words triggered measurable changes in the posterior superior parietal lobe, or researchers discovering that his verses contained the same frequency distributions as ocean waves. He was simply a terrified young man with a harp, discovering that survival sometimes requires singing in the darkness. Yet in that discovery lay a truth that would prove more enduring than any empire: that human consciousness, despite all our technological evolution, operates on rhythms unchanged since our species first looked up at star-filled skies and wondered at our place in the cosmos. The 8 Hz frequency that calmed David's racing heart in that cave 3 millennia ago still calms hearts today. The breath patterns encoded in his verses still slow, anxious breathing. The cognitive loops he created still guide restless minds toward peace. And so began one of humanity's most remarkable experiments: the systematic encoding of tranquility into words, the transformation of ancient terror into timeless comfort. What emerged from that cave was not merely poetry, but a technology of rest that would prove more reliable than any pharmaceutical, more enduring than any empire, and more universal than any language. The shepherd boy's harp fell silent as dawn painted the desert gold, but the frequencies he had discovered continued to resonate, spreading outward like ripples on an infinite pond, carrying the promise of peace to every generation that would follow. In learning to sing himself to sleep, David had taught the world a song that would never end. The cave is empty now, worn smooth by 3,000 years of wind and weather. Yet on quiet nights, when the desert air is still, you can almost hear the echo of those ancient melodies, 8 Hz vibrations, that once transformed terror into tranquility, and in doing so, changed the very nature of human rest forever. 587 years before the Common Era, Jerusalem burns. Picture the scene. Babylonian siege engines thunder against ancient walls while inside the temple. Priests race through smoke-filled corridors carrying humanity's most precious cargo, not gold or silver, but words. Scrolls containing the psalms that had comforted their people for generations now faced annihilation. What happened next would prove that some treasures are too valuable to entrust to any single place. The priests had prepared for this moment. They understood something that would not be formally recognized by scholars for another 2 millennia, that information, like life itself, survives through dispersion. In those final hours before Jerusalem's fall, they executed a plan of breathtaking audacity. Trusted runners gathered in the temple's inner chambers, each receiving portions of the psalm collection, along with destinations that would scatter these sacred texts across the known world. Watch them disappear into the night shadows carrying light. Some runners headed north toward mountain fortresses where Jewish communities had established themselves beyond Babylonian reach. Others sailed west, their precious cargo destined for emerging Jewish settlements along the Mediterranean coast. The most sacred copies vanished entirely, carried into desert caves that would guard their secrets for 2,500 years. What the priests could not have anticipated was that this desperate act of preservation would become an extraordinary experiment in textual evolution. Like seeds scattered by the wind, each group of psalms began adapting to its new environment, developing characteristics shaped by local conditions and cultural influences. In Egypt, where Jewish communities had flourished for centuries, scribes added contemplative pauses to the texts, moments of silence that mirrored the vast emptiness of the desert surrounding them. These weren't arbitrary additions. Egyptian Jews had discovered that the human mind, when processing sacred text, required strategic emptiness to achieve deeper states of awareness. Their modifications to the Psalms reflected this understanding, creating space for consciousness to rest between thoughts. Meanwhile, in Babylon itself, an entirely different adaptation was occurring. Jewish scholars, forced to live among practitioners of complex mathematical traditions, began discovering numerical patterns hidden within the psalm texts. They found that certain verses contained mystical number sequences, mathematical relationships that created cognitive loops when contemplated. These scholars were uncovering what modern neuroscience now recognizes as a fundamental principle. Repetitive numerical patterns can slow analytical thought, allowing the mind to shift into more receptive states. But perhaps most remarkably, isolated communities developed entirely new verses. Cut off from central authority, local poets felt free to expand upon the traditional texts, adding lines that addressed specific circumstances of exile and displacement. These additions weren't random improvisations. They followed the same rhythmic and structural principles that made the original psalms so effective, suggesting that the underlying technology of comfort could be learned and replicated. 70 years passed. The exile ended, and suddenly the Great Assembly faced an overwhelming question. Which versions of the Psalms preserved divine inspiration, and which reflected human innovation? Imagine the scene as representatives from scattered communities gathered in the rebuilt temple. Egyptian Jews brought texts filled with contemplative spaces. Babylonian scholars arrived with numerically enhanced versions. Isolated groups contributed entirely new compositions. Each delegation insisted their variations contained essential insights gained during the years of separation. The solution they developed reveals extraordinary wisdom about the nature of sacred text. Rather than choosing one version over others, the assembly created what we now know as the Book of Psalms, a collection that preserved the most effective elements from each tradition while maintaining overall coherence. They arranged 150 poems in 5 books, mirroring the structure of the Torah itself, with mathematical precision hidden beneath poetic beauty. Consider Psalm 119, the longest composition in the collection. It contains exactly 176 verses, 8 verses for each of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. This wasn't arbitrary numerology. The assembly had discovered that this specific structure created what we might now call an alphabet meditation, a composition that physically slowed breathing through its repetitive patterns while engaging the mind in systematic contemplation. But the assembly's most profound insight was recognizing that the Psalms' power lay not in any single perfect version, but in their capacity for adaptation. while maintaining core functionality. Like a biological organism that evolves to survive in different environments while preserving essential characteristics, the Psalms had demonstrated their ability to speak to diverse human experiences without losing their fundamental ability to induce rest and comfort. The scribes who compiled the final collection understood something that modern information theorists are only beginning to appreciate. Redundancy strengthens rather than weakens a system. By preserving multiple approaches to the same therapeutic goal, contemplative pauses from Egypt, numerical patterns from Babylon, expanded verses from isolated communities, they created a collection robust enough to serve virtually any human temperament or circumstance. As the assembly worked, they made another crucial discovery. The variations that had developed during exile weren't corruptions of original texts. They were evidence of the Psalms' living nature. Each community had instinctively enhanced the elements that served their particular needs, while preserving the underlying technology that made these compositions effective across cultures and circumstances. The Egyptian editions of contemplative space proved especially valuable. When the assembly tested these modified versions, they found that strategic pauses created cognitive reset points, moments where the mind could release accumulated tension before continuing. These weren't mere aesthetic choices, they were neurological interventions disguised as textual elements. Similarly, the Babylonian numerical discoveries revealed hidden architectures within the texts. Certain psalms contained mathematical ratios that matched natural phenomena: the golden ratio found in spiral shells, the Fibonacci sequences visible in pinecone arrangements, the wave patterns created by wind on water. The exile communities had uncovered evidence that these ancient compositions reflected deep mathematical principles governing both consciousness and cosmos. Most remarkably, the new verses created by isolated communities often improved upon the originals in measurable ways. When tested for their ability to induce relaxation, some of these additions proved more effective than traditional texts, suggesting that the principles underlying psalm composition could be learned and applied by poets who understood the underlying technology of comfort. The Assembly's final collection represented something unprecedented in human history, a scientifically optimized anthology of consciousness-altering texts, compiled through what amounted to a Feynman history, multi-generational, multicultural research project. The exile that had seemed to threaten the Psalms' survival had instead perfected them, creating a collection that could serve human needs across virtually any circumstance or culture. When the last scroll was sealed and placed in the rebuilt temple, the assembly had accomplished something remarkable. They had transformed a collection of ancient Hebrew poetry into a universal technology of rest compositions that would prove equally effective whether whispered by Jewish exiles in Babylon, chanted by Christian monks in medieval monasteries, or recited by modern insomniacs in hospital beds. The midnight missions that carried scrolls from burning Jerusalem had succeeded beyond their planners' wildest dreams. What began as a desperate attempt to preserve sacred texts had become an inadvertent experiment in consciousness. Research, conducted across 70 years and multiple continents, involving thousands of practitioners and resulting in a collection optimized through practical testing on an unprecedented scale, the Psalms had survived their first great trial, not merely intact, but improved. They had learned to adapt while maintaining their essential nature, a characteristic that would prove crucial as they faced the even greater challenges ahead. For this was only the beginning of their journey through human history, a journey that would take them into monastery cells and royal courts, laboratory scanners and smartphone apps, always carrying within their ancient words the promise of peace for any soul willing to speak them into darkness. In the mountains of 6th century Egypt, where the desert meets the sky in endless silence, a group of hermits made a discovery that would reshape human understanding of consciousness itself. These desert fathers, seeking nothing more than spiritual purification, had stumbled upon something extraordinary. reciting all 150 psalms over the course of 7 days, created profound and measurable changes in human awareness. Picture Brother Anthony, 20 years in the desert, awakening before dawn in his stone cell. The stars wheel overhead in patterns unchanged since David first saw them from his cave, and Anthony begins the ancient rhythm that will carry him through another day of discovery. He has no knowledge of neurotransmitters or circadian biology, yet his practice aligns perfectly with the deepest rhythms of human physiology. The Desert Fathers had developed precise schedules through pure observation. Matins at 3 in the morning, when melatonin reaches its natural peak and the boundary between sleeping and waking grows gossamer thin. Lords at sunrise, as cortisol begins its daily climb. Compline at 9 in the evening, precisely when the brain begins preparing for sleep. They had mapped the optimal times for consciousness intervention without understanding the biochemical machinery they were operating. But it was in the medieval, the monasteries of Europe, that this intuitive science reached its full flowering. Watch as these developments unfold across centuries of careful experimentation, each generation building upon the discoveries of the last. At the great monastery of St. Gall in Switzerland, Brother Notke spent decades documenting something remarkable. Different psalm tones affected human temperaments in predictable ways. Rising melodies energized brothers prone to melancholy, while descending patterns calmed those of choleric disposition. What Notke was observing, though he could not name it, was the direct effect of sound frequency on the human nervous system. Modern neuroscience has validated Notke's careful observations with startling precision. Gregorian chant frequencies between 110 and 130 Hz, exactly the range. Medieval monks preferred activate the vagus nerve, the longest cranial nerve that connects brain to body. This activation triggers the parasympathetic nervous system's rest response, flooding the bloodstream with chemicals that promote relaxation and prepare the body for restorative sleep. The monks had discovered, through centuries of patient experimentation, how to hack human neurobiology using nothing more than breath and sound. Their chanted psalms created predictable physiological responses, decreased heart rate, lowered blood pressure, increased production of sleep-promoting chemicals. They had transformed ancient Hebrew poetry into precision medicine, administered through the medium of human voice. Consider the extraordinary sophistication of their approach. Medieval monasteries operated like research laboratories, with hundreds of subjects participating in carefully controlled experiments that lasted entire lifetimes. Each monastery developed slight variations in practice, creating natural comparison groups that allowed for refinement of technique across generations. At Cluny Abbey in France, monks discovered that certain Latin translations of Hebrew psalms proved more effective than others at inducing restful states. They had accidentally uncovered a principle that modern linguistics would later formalize. Some languages contain inherent rhythmic patterns that synchronize more effectively with human breathing and cardiovascular cycles. Meanwhile, at Monte Cassino in Italy, Brother Benedict was developing what would become known as the Rule, a systematic approach to communal psalm recitation that optimized both individual and group effects. Benedict had observed that when multiple voices chanted in unison, the therapeutic impact multiplied exponentially. Individual breathing patterns synchronized, creating a collective respiratory rhythm that enhanced the neurological effects experienced by each participant. The rule specified not merely when to recite psalms, but how. The pace of delivery, the length of pauses, the number of participants required for optimal effect. Benedict was codifying discoveries about group consciousness that neuroscientists would not begin to understand until the 21st century. But perhaps most remarkably, these European developments were occurring simultaneously with parallel discoveries in other traditions. In the hidden academies of medieval Spain, Kabbalistic scholars were uncovering gematria codes within psalm verses, mathematical relationships that created cognitive loops when contemplated. These numerical patterns, they found, could slow analytical thought while deepening contemplative awareness. The Kabbalists had discovered something profound. Hebrew letters carried not only semantic meaning but numerical values, and certain combinations created mathematical sequences that resonated with natural patterns. When practitioners contemplated these number relationships while reciting psalms, their minds entered states of profound receptivity, accessing levels of consciousness normally available only during deep sleep. This mystical tradition spread through hidden networks across Europe and North Africa. Catherine of Siena taught psalm-breathing techniques to plague victims, discovering that specific recitation patterns could actually strengthen immune response during illness. Her methods, passed secretly from teacher to student, represented practical applications of what modern immunology now recognizes as the connection between stress reduction and disease resistance. Even more surprising were discoveries emerging from the Islamic world. Sufi masters, working with Arabic translations of Hebrew psalms, found that certain rhythmic patterns produce similar consciousness-altering effects when chanted according to specific mathematical formulas. They had independently confirmed that the underlying technology of psalm effectiveness transcended language barriers, operating through rhythmic and numerical principles that appeared to be universal aspects of human consciousness. Each tradition was converging on the same remarkable truth. Certain combinations of sound, rhythm, and meaning could bypass conscious resistance and access primitive brain regions controlling the sleep-wake cycle. The medieval practitioners were mapping neurological pathways that modern sleep medicine would not identify until the development of brain scanning technology. At the monastery of Saint Denis near Paris, monks documented something that would astonish modern sleep researchers. Regular psalm practice actually restructured sleep architecture itself. Practitioners required less overall sleep while experiencing deeper, more restorative rest phases. They had discovered that consciousness could be trained, that the boundaries between waking and sleeping states were more fluid than anyone had imagined. The implications were staggering. Medieval monasteries were essentially operating as residential treatment centers for sleep disorders, using techniques that modern medicine was only beginning to understand. Their success rates, measured by centuries of observation, exceeded anything achieved by contemporary pharmaceutical interventions. Brother Thomas of Quito spent 40 years documenting the effects of different psalm combinations on various types of insomnia. His notebooks, preserved in monastery libraries, read like modern clinical trials, careful observation of symptoms, systematic testing of interventions, detailed recording of outcomes. Thomas had developed personalized psalm prescriptions centuries before the concept of individualized medicine existed. What unified all these diverse discoveries was recognition that psalms operated through multiple pathways simultaneously. The semantic content provided meaningful focus for anxious minds. The rhythmic patterns synchronized with natural physiological cycles. The mathematical relationships embedded in Hebrew letter combinations created cognitive loops that guided consciousness toward receptive states, and the accumulated spiritual weight of centuries of practice added therapeutic power that increased with each generation of practitioners. The medieval monasteries had proven something extraordinary, that ancient Hebrew poetry, when delivered according to principles derived through careful observation and systematic experimentation, could reliably alter human consciousness in ways that promoted health, extended lifespan, and enhanced overall well-being. They had transformed intuitive spiritual practice into reproducible therapeutic technology. As the medieval period drew to a close, monastery libraries contained detailed records of discoveries that would anticipate by centuries many of the insights of modern neuroscience. They had mapped the optimal timing for consciousness intervention, identified the sound frequencies most effective for nervous system regulation, and developed group practices that enhanced individual outcomes through collective synchronization. The bells that called. The medieval monks to prayer were summoning them to something far more sophisticated than spiritual exercise. They were participating in humanity's most advanced research project into the nature of consciousness itself, an investigation that would continue through scientific revolution and technological advancement, always returning to the same ancient truth, that certain words, spoken at certain times, in certain ways, remain our most reliable path to rest. 1998. The University of Pennsylvania Hospital. Dr. Andrew Newberg watches in fascination as brain scan images flicker across his computer screen, each one revealing something that challenges everything. Modern medicine thought it knew about the relationship between consciousness and the human brain. On the scanning table lies Sister Margaret, a Franciscan nun who has spent 30 years reciting evening psalms. As she whispers the familiar words of Psalm 23, sophisticated imaging equipment tracks blood flow through her brain, creating a real-time map of consciousness in action. What Newberg witnesses will revolutionize scientific understanding of how ancient practices affect modern minds. The results are nothing short of extraordinary. As Sister Margaret reaches the phrase, "He makes me lie down in green pastures," specific regions of her brain begin showing dramatic changes. The posterior superior parietal lobe, the area responsible for maintaining the boundary between self and surroundings, becomes significantly less active. Simultaneously, the frontal cortex, which processes analytical thought, shows decreased activity, while areas associated with peaceful emotions begin glowing with increased blood flow. Newberg has documented something that mystics have described for millennia, but science has never before witnessed: the dissolution of ego boundaries during spiritual practice. Sister Margaret is literally experiencing a neurological shift that makes her feel held by something greater as she recites words composed 3,000 years ago in the Judean wilderness. But this is only the beginning of discoveries that will bridge the gap between ancient wisdom and modern understanding. At Harvard Medical School, Dr. Herbert Benson makes his own groundbreaking observations. Using sophisticated monitoring equipment, he measures what happens to human physiology during psalm recitation. The results astound even veteran researchers who have spent decades studying the mind-body connection. During repetitive prayer and psalm recitation, oxygen consumption decreases by 17%, a reduction so significant it suggests fundamental changes in cellular metabolism. Heart rate slows by an average of 3 beats per minute, while blood pressure drops measurably. Most remarkably, brainwave patterns shift into theta frequencies, the same 8 Hz vibrations that David's harp produced in that ancient cave. Benson has identified what he terms the relaxation response, a physiological state that appears to be the opposite of the stress response that characterizes modern life. When people recite psalms according to traditional patterns, their bodies enter a healing mode that optimizes everything from immune function to DNA repair mechanisms. These laboratory discoveries gain even more significance when researchers at Tel Aviv University make a stunning linguistic breakthrough. Dr. Sarah Cohen, studying the structure of ancient Hebrew, uncovers something that explains why psalm translations maintain their effectiveness across languages and cultures. Hebrew contains more vowel-consonant alternations than virtually any other language, creating natural breathing rhythms when spoken aloud. But more remarkably, the specific arrangement of these sounds in psalm texts forces speakers into optimal breathing patterns without conscious effort. When Dr. Cohen analyzes Psalm 23 in its original Hebrew, she discovers something extraordinary. The text subconsciously programs peaceful associations by coordinating breath and meaning. The Hebrew version forces speakers to exhale on comfort words, green pastures, still waters, restore, while requiring inhalation on challenge words, valley, shadow, enemies. This isn't accidental. Ancient Hebrew poets were encoding respiratory therapy into the semantic structure of their compositions, creating texts that physically retrain the nervous system through the simple act of reading aloud. At Stanford University's sleep laboratory, Dr. Emily Chen documents perhaps the most remarkable finding of all. Using polysomnography equipment that can track the precise moment when consciousness shifts from waking to sleeping, she studies what happens when people recite psalms during the transition period, known as the hypnagogic state. Her results reveal why bedtime psalm traditions have proven so enduring across cultures. The hypnagogic state, that twilight zone between waking and sleeping, represents a period when the mind becomes highly suggestible, more receptive to programming than at any other time. Ancient practitioners had intuitively discovered this neurological window and developed texts specifically designed to exploit it. When psalms are recited during hypnagogic states, they embed themselves deeply in memory systems that operate below conscious awareness. This explains why people who learned evening psalms in childhood continue to find them comforting decades later, even when religious beliefs have changed. The neurological programming installed during hypnagogic recitation appears to be remarkably durable. Dr. Chen's research also reveals why certain psalms prove more effective than others for sleep induction. Psalm 4, when analyzed through digital signal processing, contains frequency distributions that precisely match ocean wave patterns. Psalm 131 shows rhythmic characteristics identical to maternal heartbeat as heard from the womb. Psalm 23's cadence mirrors the walking pace of sheep, triggering what appears to be ancestral memories of safety and protection. These discoveries suggest that effective psalms work by recreating the acoustic environment of fundamental human experiences: the safety of the womb, the rhythm of peaceful movement, the sound of natural phenomena that signaled security to our evolutionary ancestors. The ancient poets had somehow encoded these primal comfort patterns into verbal compositions that could trigger deep relaxation responses across generations and cultures. At the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, quantum physicist Dr. Chen Wang makes a discovery that explains how psalm translations maintain their effectiveness despite dramatic changes in language structure. Using mathematical analysis typically applied to wave phenomena, he identifies what he calls the golden ratio of rest, embedded in effective psalm compositions. The mathematical ratios between stressed and unstressed syllables remain remarkably constant across translations, preserving resonance patterns that appear to be fundamental to human consciousness. When these ratios are maintained, translations retain their therapeutic effectiveness regardless of linguistic differences. When the ratios are altered, as often happens in paraphrased versions, the physiological impact diminishes significantly. Dr. Wang's work suggests that psalms operate according to mathematical principles that transcend semantic meaning. Like musical compositions that remain beautiful regardless of the instruments used to perform them, effective psalms preserve their therapeutic power as long as their underlying mathematical relationships remain intact. Perhaps most remarkably, research at the University of California reveals that regular psalm practice actually changes brain structure over time. Using magnetic resonance imaging to study the brains of long-term practitioners, Dr. Lisa Rodriguez documents increased gray matter density in regions associated with emotional regulation and stress management. People who recite psalms regularly for more than 5 years show measurably thicker cortical regions responsible for processing positive emotions, while areas associated with fear and anxiety become less reactive. The ancient practice appears to be physically rewiring the brain for greater resilience and peace. These structural changes help explain observations that have puzzled sleep researchers for decades. Why some people seem naturally gifted at falling asleep, while others struggle with chronic insomnia despite identical life circumstances. Regular psalm practitioners have literally trained their brains to enter restful states more easily, creating neural pathways that facilitate the transition from waking to sleeping consciousness. The convergence of these diverse research findings creates a remarkable picture. Modern neuroscience has validated what medieval monks observed through careful experimentation and what ancient Hebrew poets encoded into their compositions. Certain combinations of sound, rhythm, and meaning can reliably alter human consciousness in ways that promote health, enhance immune function, and facilitate restorative sleep. But perhaps the most profound discovery is that these effects appear to be cumulative across generations. Brain imaging studies of people whose families have practiced psalm recitation for multiple generations show enhanced responsiveness to the texts, suggesting that regular practice may create epigenetic changes that are passed to offspring. The implications are staggering. What began as desperate songs in a limestone cave has evolved into a reproducible technology for consciousness modification, one that operates through multiple biological pathways simultaneously and becomes more effective with each. The generation of practitioners. As Dr. Newberg reviews years of brain scan data, he realizes that science has answered an ancient question while raising profound new ones. We now understand how psalms work through precise coordination of respiratory patterns, strategic activation of specific neural networks, and exploitation of hypnagogic suggestibility windows. But the deeper mystery remains. How did Bronze Age poets, working without knowledge of neuroscience or brain anatomy, develop techniques that modern technology has only recently been able to explain? The answer may lie in recognizing that consciousness itself guided the development of these practices. Just as evolution shapes organisms for survival, perhaps human consciousness naturally develops tools for its own optimization. The Psalms may represent not just artistic achievement, but evidence of consciousness, learning to heal itself through the medium of carefully crafted words. In laboratory after laboratory, sophisticated equipment has confirmed what 3 billion people already knew from experience. That certain, ancient words, spoken at certain times, in certain ways, remain humanity's most reliable path to rest. Science has illuminated the mechanisms, but the mystery of how such profound technology emerged from such simple materials continues to inspire wonder in every researcher who studies these remarkable compositions. From the highlands of Ethiopia to the neon-lit streets of Seoul, from African-American churches in Mississippi to indigenous communities in the Amazon, something remarkable has been occurring for the past 2 millennia. The same Hebrew verses that once calmed a shepherd boy in a cave have undergone the most extraordinary global experiment in cultural adaptation, transforming to fit every language, every tradition, every human circumstance, while maintaining their fundamental power to guide consciousness toward rest. Picture midnight in Addis Ababa, where Orthodox priests gather in ancient stone churches to chant the Dawit, their name for the Psalms. The Ethiopian. Tradition preserves elements lost elsewhere. Original Hebrew rhythms translated into Ge'ez, creating tonal patterns that modern acoustics confirms are optimally calibrated for human nervous system entrainment. As voices rise and fall in prescribed cadences, heart rates synchronize across the congregation, creating collective breathing rhythms that amplify individual therapeutic effects. The Ethiopian priests discovered, through 15 centuries of practice, that group psalm recitation operates according to principles of acoustic resonance. When multiple voices blend in specific harmonic relationships, they create standing wave patterns that enhance the neurological impact experienced by each participant. What began as spiritual practice has become, through accumulated observation, a sophisticated technology for collective consciousness modification. Travel now to Seoul, where Korean Christians have developed their own remarkable adaptation. In churches scattered throughout the Reblois, city's tower blocks, the congregations sing the Shipyeon psalm translations that preserve the original Hebrew's vowel-consonant alternations while incorporating Korean tonal elements that enhance breathing synchronization. The results, measured by sleep clinics serving the city's chronically insomniac population, show effectiveness rates that rival pharmaceutical interventions. Korean translators made a crucial discovery. Certain Korean phonemes produce the same neurological effects as Hebrew sounds when arranged in similar patterns. They had identified universal acoustic principles that transcend linguistic boundaries, sound combinations that appear to be hardwired into human consciousness, regardless of cultural background. But perhaps nowhere has psalm adaptation proven more innovative than in African American churches across the American South. Here, ancient Hebrew compositions have evolved into call and response patterns that synchronize breathing across entire congregations, while preserving the therapeutic core of the original texts. Consider what happens during a typical Sunday evening service in rural Mississippi. As the pastor recites Psalm 27, the congregation responds with rhythmic affirmations that require coordinated breathing. "The Lord is my light and my salvation." Congregation inhales together. "Whom shall I fear?" Collective exhale. "The Lord is the stronghold of my life." Shared inhalation creates acoustically measurable pressure changes in the sanctuary. This isn't merely cultural adaptation, it's neurological engineering disguised as worship. The call and response format forces participants into synchronized breathing patterns that trigger group relaxation responses, creating therapeutic effects that exceed what individual recitation can achieve. African American churches have essentially developed group therapy protocols using 3,000-year-old Hebrew poetry as their foundation. Meanwhile, in Latino communities across the Americas, psalm traditions have incorporated guitar rhythms that match the human heartbeat at rest, 60 to 70 beats per minute. Mariachi versions of Psalm 23, popular from Mexico to Argentina, maintain precise tempo relationships that optimize cardiovascular entrainment. Street musicians have unknowingly preserved acoustic principles that promote physiological rest through the simple act of matching musical rhythm to biological rhythm. These diverse cultural adaptations all point to the same remarkable conclusion. The mathematical relationships that make psalms effective operate at levels deeper than language or tradition. They appear to be universal aspects of human consciousness that manifest regardless of cultural context. At MIT, quantum physicist Dr. Chen Wang has spent years analyzing psalm translations from 47 different languages and cultural traditions. His findings reveal something extraordinary. Despite radical differences in grammar, syntax, and phonetic structure, effective translations preserve what he calls the golden ratio of rest, specific mathematical relationships between sound and silence, stress and relaxation, meaning and pause. Dr. Wang's research shows that psalms work by encoding fundamental patterns found throughout nature. The spiral arrangements visible in nautilus shells, the mathematical sequences governing flower petal arrangements, the wave patterns created by wind on water, all these natural phenomena share mathematical relationships with effective psalm translations. Ancient poets had somehow discovered verbal formulas that mirror the mathematical principles governing natural systems that humans find inherently peaceful. This discovery explains why psalm adaptations remain effective across such diverse cultures. Like mathematical constants that remain true regardless of the number system used to express them, the underlying patterns of effective psalms transcend the specific languages and traditions that give them voice. Digital analysis has revealed even more surprising connections. Psalm 4, when subjected to frequency analysis, shows wave patterns identical to those produced by ocean surf. Psalm 131 exhibits rhythmic characteristics that precisely match maternal heartbeat as detected through prenatal ultrasound. Psalm 23's spoken cadence mirrors the walking pace of sheep, a rhythm that appears to trigger deep relaxation responses even in people who have never encountered actual sheep. These correlations suggest that effective psalms work by recreating the acoustic signatures of experiences that promoted safety and rest throughout human evolutionary history. The womb environment, the sound of gentle waves, the rhythm of peaceful movement, all these fundamental comfort patterns have been encoded into verbal compositions that can trigger the same neurological responses experienced during the original situations. Modern technology has enabled even more sophisticated applications of psalm effectiveness principles. Apps like abideandpray.com use artificial intelligence to personalize psalm delivery based on users' real-time physiological data. Heart rate variability sensors detect stress levels and automatically adjust the tempo and tone of psalm recitation to optimize individual therapeutic effects. Yet paradoxically, the most effective applications often remain the simplest. In hospice facilities across the world, volunteers have discovered that whispered psalm recitation, soft enough to be barely audible, proves more calming than enhanced audio versions. The human voice, breathing Hebrew words composed 3 millennia ago, carries therapeutic power that sophisticated technology cannot improve upon. Research at Stanford's Medical Center has documented remarkable results from what they term psalm prescription protocols. Cancer patients who receive 15 minutes of personalized psalm recitation before chemotherapy treatments show significantly reduced anxiety levels and improved immune response markers. The ancient words appear to activate healing systems that modern medicine is only beginning to understand. Even more remarkable are findings from pediatric sleep clinics. Children who learn simple psalm verses in their native languages develop stronger sleep patterns that persist throughout their lives. The early programming appears to create neurological pathways that facilitate rest, suggesting that childhood psalm exposure may represent a form of preventive medicine for age-related sleep disorders. At Harvard's Divinity School, comparative religion scholars have documented psalm traditions in over 200 distinct cultures, each maintaining effectiveness while reflecting local adaptations. Tibetan Buddhists chant psalm translations that incorporate traditional meditation techniques. Australian Aboriginal communities have integrated psalm rhythms into Jori, Dreamtime stories. Even secular humanist groups have developed versions that preserve therapeutic effectiveness while removing religious content. This universal adaptability points to something profound about human consciousness itself. The patterns that make psalms effective appear to be hardwired into our species at levels deeper than cultural conditioning or religious belief. They operate through biological mechanisms that remained constant throughout human development, creating healing responses that transcend the specific worldviews that originally gave them meaning. Yet the most surprising discovery may be that these effects continue to strengthen across generations. Families who have practiced psalm recitation for multiple generations show enhanced responsiveness to the texts, with brain imaging revealing increased sensitivity in regions associated with peaceful emotions. The practice appears to create epigenetic changes that are inherited, making each generation more naturally attuned to the therapeutic patterns encoded in these ancient compositions. As researchers continue mapping the global spread of psalm traditions, they are documenting something unprecedented in human history: the evolution of a therapeutic technology that improves through cultural transmission while maintaining core effectiveness across radically different contexts. From Ethiopian highlands to Korean cities, from Mississippi churches to Amazon communities, the same fundamental patterns continue to guide human consciousness toward rest. The Hebrew shepherd who first sang to calm his fears could never have imagined that his desperate compositions would adapt to serve every human culture while retaining their power to transform terror into tranquility. Yet that is precisely what has occurred. The development of universal therapeutic technology, disguised as simple poetry, proved effective through the most extensive clinical trial in human history. 3,000 years of cross-cultural practice by billions of participants, all reporting the same fundamental result. In learning to encode comfort into words, David created something more enduring than any empire patterns of peace that could adapt to any culture while preserving their essential nature, ensuring that no human being, regardless of language or tradition, would ever need to face darkness alone. In a gleaming laboratory beneath Tokyo's Keio University, Dr. Hiroshi Tanaka adjusts the controls on humanity's most advanced sleep induction chamber. The Psalm Pod, as his team calls it, represents the convergence of 3,000 years of wisdom with 21st century technology. As volunteer subjects settle into the isolation chamber, they are about to experience something unprecedented. Hebrew verses combining with precisely calibrated binaural beats to achieve deep sleep in 20 minutes instead of the average 68. The pod itself is a marvel of acoustic engineering. Its curved walls match the resonance frequency of human brainwaves during theta states, while embedded speakers deliver psalm recitations recorded in caves with naturally perfect acoustic properties. But the true innovation lies in the real-time biofeedback system that adjusts the experience based on each individual's neurological responses. As participants listen to Psalm 23 in ancient Hebrew, sensors monitor their brainwave patterns, heart rate variability, and breathing rhythms. When the system detects the onset of hypnagogic states, it subtly modifies the audio delivery, adjusting tempo to match slowing heart rates, fine-tuning frequency to optimize neural entrainment, creating a personalized pathway into deep sleep that adapts moment by moment to each person's unique physiology. Dr. Tanaka's preliminary results suggest something remarkable. Regular users of the Psalm Pod show permanent improvements in sleep architecture, requiring less overall sleep while experiencing deeper plies. Restoration phases. The technology appears to be training the brain to access optimal rest states more efficiently, creating lasting benefits that persist even without the device. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, NASA researchers face an entirely different challenge. How do you maintain healthy sleep patterns during 18-month journeys to Mars, where traditional circadian cues disappear and psychological stress reaches unprecedented levels? Their solution draws directly from Psalm research conducted in university laboratories worldwide. The Mars mission sleep protocol combines ancient Hebrew texts with precision-timed light therapy, creating artificial circadian rhythms that sustain psychological health across interplanetary distances. Astronauts practice psalm recitation during scheduled rest periods, using the same 8 Hz frequencies that calmed David in his cave to maintain neural equilibrium in the hostile environment of deep space. Early trials conducted in Earth-based isolation chambers show promising results. Participants who practice the Mars Psalm protocol maintain stable mood and sleep patterns during simulated deep space missions, while control groups show significant psychological deterioration after several months of isolation. The ancient technology of comfort, refined through millennia of human practice, may prove crucial for humanity's expansion beyond Earth. But perhaps the most revolutionary development emerges from an unexpected collaboration between Israeli neuroscientists and Tibetan monks. The Psalms Sleep Protocol, as their joint research project is known, represents the first systematic integration of ancient wisdom traditions with modern sleep medicine. Dr. Rachel Goldstein of the Weizmann Institute explains their approach. We're essentially reverse engineering 3,000 years of unconscious experimentation. Every culture that successfully adapted Psalm traditions discovered something about optimal consciousness states. By combining these insights with Buddhist meditation techniques and contemporary neuroscience, we're developing interventions that work faster and more reliably than anything previously available. The protocol begins with precisely timed light exposure that synchronizes circadian rhythms. Participants then engage in controlled breathing exercises derived from Tibetan practices, while listening to psalm recitations calibrated to their individual neural response patterns. The combination appears to optimize every biological system involved in sleep regulation simultaneously. Clinical trials across multiple sleep centers show remarkable results. Chronic insomniacs who previously required pharmaceutical intervention achieve normal sleep patterns within 2 weeks of protocol training. Even more impressive, the benefits appear to be self-sustaining. Participants continue experiencing improved sleep for months after completing the initial training program. Virtual reality companies have seized upon these developments, creating immersive psalm experiences that transport users into historically accurate recreations of ancient environments. Participants can walk through David's actual landscapes while hearing verses recorded in caves with perfect acoustic properties, or join medieval monks for Compline in digitally reconstructed monastery settings. The psychological impact of these immersive experiences exceeds researchers' expectations. Users report feeling connected to an unbroken chain of human experience spanning millennia, creating therapeutic benefits that extend far beyond sleep improvement. The sense of historical continuity appears to address modern anxiety about isolation and meaninglessness, providing comfort through connection to larger human narratives. Yet the most promising developments may be surprisingly low-tech. Architectural firms specializing in healthcare design have begun creating psalm spaces, hospital rooms, and treatment facilities where wall curves match psalm sound wavelengths and acoustic properties to optimize speech resonance. Patients in these specially designed environments show accelerated healing rates and reduced need for pain medication. The principle is elegantly simple. Spaces designed according to acoustic principles derived from psalm research naturally promote the physiological states associated with healing and rest. By shaping physical environments to optimize the delivery of ancient therapeutic texts, architects are creating buildings that actively promote human well-being. Community health initiatives have embraced these discoveries with remarkable enthusiasm. Churches, synagogues, and community centers across the world now host evening psalm circles group recitation sessions that combine social connection with proven therapeutic techniques. Participants report not only improved sleep but enhanced sense of community belonging and reduced feelings of isolation. Research documenting these community programs reveals something profound. Group psalm practice amplifies individual therapeutic effects by approximately 400%. The phenomenon appears to operate through multiple mechanisms. Synchronized breathing creates group coherence. Shared focus enhances individual concentration, and collective intention strengthens the psychological impact of ancient words. Dr. Sarah Chen of Stanford's Social Psychology Department explains, "We're witnessing the revival of practices that our ancestors understood intuitively. Humans evolved as social creatures, and our nervous systems are optimized for group coherence. When people recite psalms together, they're not just sharing words, they're synchronizing the biological rhythms that regulate mood, stress response, and sleep quality." Medical schools have begun integrating psalm research into their curricula, teaching future physicians to recognize sleep disorders that might respond better to ancient interventions than modern. Pharmaceuticals. The approach isn't anti-technology, but rather represents an expansion of available therapeutic tools, offering options for patients who prefer non-pharmaceutical interventions or experience adverse effects from sleep medications. Dr. Michael Rodriguez of Johns Hopkins Medical School notes, "We're training doctors to think like medieval monks, to understand that certain words delivered at specific times through particular methods can trigger predictable physiological responses. It's not mysticism. It's applied neuroscience using tools that happen to be 3,000 years old." Sleep clinics worldwide report increasing demand for psalm-based interventions. Patients arrive requesting specific protocols they've researched online, often bringing family psalm traditions that clinicians help optimize using contemporary understanding of sleep physiology. The collaboration between ancient wisdom and modern medicine is creating personalized approaches that honor cultural heritage while maximizing therapeutic effectiveness. Pharmaceutical companies, initially skeptical of research suggesting that ancient poetry could match the effectiveness of modern sleep medications, have begun investing in hybrid approaches. Several major companies now fund research into combinations of traditional psalm practice with precisely timed medication delivery, seeking to reduce drug dosages while maintaining therapeutic benefits. The results suggest a future where sleep medicine becomes increasingly personalized and multimodal. Rather than one-size-fits-all pharmaceutical solutions, practitioners may prescribe combinations of ancient techniques, modern technology, and minimal medication tailored to individual genetics, cultural background, and personal preference. Perhaps most remarkably, artificial intelligence systems trained on psalm effectiveness data have begun generating new compositions that follow the same principles as ancient texts while addressing contemporary concerns. These algorithmically created verses, tested for physiological impact using brain imaging and biometric monitoring, show promise for helping people whose cultural backgrounds don't include traditional psalm exposure. Yet researchers consistently find that these AI-generated compositions, while effective, never quite match the power of texts refined through centuries of human use. There appears to be something about the accumulated spiritual weight of ancient words spoken by millions of voices across dozens of generations that cannot be replicated through algorithmic optimization alone. As Dr. Tanaka reviews data from his latest PsalmPod trials, he reflects on the profound implications of their discoveries. We've proven that Bronze Age poetry contains therapeutic algorithms more sophisticated than anything our most advanced computers can devise. The question isn't whether these techniques work, it's whether our technology-dependent culture has the wisdom to integrate them into modern life. The answer may already be emerging in the form of architectural psalm spaces, community recitation circles, personalized sleep protocols, and hybrid medical approaches that honor both ancient wisdom and contemporary understanding. The future of sleep medicine appears to be not replacement of ancient techniques with modern technology, but rather the careful integration of both traditions to create therapeutic approaches that serve the whole human being. In learning to sing himself to sleep 3 millennia ago, David inadvertently designed technology that would prove more enduring than any empire, more reliable than any pharmaceutical, and more universally applicable than any modern invention. Tomorrow's sleep sanctuaries will echo with the same frequencies that once vibrated through a limestone cave, carrying the promise of peace to every soul willing to speak ancient words into the eternal darkness. Every night, as darkness falls across 6 continents and a dozen time zones, something extraordinary occurs. 2 billion people, Christians and Jews, Muslims and Buddhists, believers and skeptics alike, whisper variations of the same Hebrew verses that David sang to sheep under desert stars 3,000 years ago. In hospital rooms and suburban bedrooms, in refugee camps and luxury hotels, in languages David never heard spoken by voices he could never have imagined, the same ancient frequencies continue to guide human consciousness toward rest. The persistence defies every rational explanation. We have decoded DNA, walked on the moon, created artificial intelligence, and mapped the human brain down to individual neurons. We can transplant hearts, cure cancers that once seemed hopeless, and communicate instantly across any distance. Yet still, when darkness falls and anxiety rises, we turn to Bronze Age poetry composed by a shepherd boy hiding in a cave. Why? The answer lies not in what we have discovered, but in what remains fundamentally unchanged. Human consciousness, despite technological evolution that would astonish our ancestors, operates according to rhythms as ancient as our species itself. We still fear what rustles in darkness. We still need assurance that someone watches while we surrender to unconsciousness. We still require the same neurochemical cascades, the same brainwave patterns, the same physiological conditions for rest that sustained our ancestors across millennia of human development. Consider what happens when you whisper, "The Lord is my shepherd," in the moments before sleep. Your analytical cortex, the the evolutionary newcomer that spends its days processing emails and calculating mortgage payments, finally receives permission to rest. But those words bypass your thinking mind entirely, speaking directly to neural circuits that evolved when our ancestors huddled around fires, scanning darkness for predators. Modern life floods us with stimuli our nervous systems never evolved to handle. Blue light from screens disrupts circadian rhythms designed for sun and firelight. Endless notifications trigger stress responses meant for immediate physical threats. Cortisol spikes that once prepared our ancestors to flee from lions now pulse through bodies sitting safely at desks, creating exhaustion without rest, alertness without peace. Yet our sleep architecture remains stubbornly primitive. We still cycle through the same 90-minute patterns identified in sleeping infants and observed in virtually every mammalian species. We still require the same chemical cascades of melatonin and adenosine, the same theta brainwave states, the same parasympathetic nervous system activation that characterized sleep long before humans developed language, much less composed poetry. Psalms work because they address the sleeper, not the thinker. When you recite, "He makes me lie down in green pastures," neurons that evolved to scan for danger finally receive the all clear, the signal they have been awaiting. The ancient poetry provides what no app or pharmaceutical can offer. Words worn smooth by 3,000 years of human breath, carrying the accumulated peace of everyone who ever spoke them into darkness. Dr. Andrew Newberg's brain scans have shown us what happens during psalm recitation: the dissolution of boundaries between self and surroundings, the quieting of analytical thought, the activation of neural networks associated with safety and comfort. But the deeper mystery is how Bronze Age poets, working without knowledge of neuroscience or brain anatomy, developed techniques that operate with surgical precision on consciousness itself. The answer may be that consciousness guided its own healing. Just as evolution shapes organisms for survival, perhaps human awareness naturally develops tools for its own optimization. The Psalms represent not just artistic achievement, but evidence of consciousness, learning to repair itself through carefully crafted words. Every effective psalm exploits the same fundamental vulnerabilities in human psychology that have remained constant across our species' development. We are pattern-seeking creatures who find meaning in repetition, comfort in rhythm, and peace in predictable sequences. We respond to certain sound frequencies with involuntary relaxation, to specific breathing patterns with neurochemical changes, to mathematical relationships with cognitive shifts that occur below conscious awareness. Ancient poets discovered these psychological constants through the same process that led to every human innovation: trial, error, and retention of what works. The Psalms that survived 3 millennia did so because they consistently produced the desired effect across diverse populations and circumstances. They represent the result of humanity's longest-running clinical trial, tested on billions of subjects across dozens of generations. But perhaps most remarkably, these effects appear to strengthen rather than diminish with repetition. Unlike pharmaceutical interventions, which often lose effectiveness through tolerance, or psychological techniques, which may become stale through familiarity, psalms seem to grow more powerful with practice. Brain imaging studies show that long-term practitioners develop enhanced responsiveness to the texts, with neural pathways becoming more efficient at producing therapeutic states. This suggests something profound about the relationship between consciousness and language. The words we speak repeatedly appear to rewire our brains for the states they promote. People who recite psalms regularly literally train their nervous systems for peace, creating neural architectures that facilitate rest while maintaining resilience during stress. Modern research has confirmed what medieval monks discovered through centuries of observation. Certain combinations of sound, rhythm, and meaning can reliably alter human consciousness in measurable ways, But the medieval practitioners went further, recognizing that these effects compound when practiced in community, creating group coherence that amplifies individual benefits. This explains why psalm traditions persist most strongly in communal settings, why churches and synagogues maintain evening services, why families continue bedtime recitations, why online communities form around shared practice of ancient texts. The therapeutic power increases when voices join together, creating acoustic resonance that enhances the neurological impact experienced by each participant. In our age of unprecedented isolation, where technology connects us globally while separating us locally, psalms offer something irreplaceable: direct access to shared human experience spanning millennia. When you recite Psalm 23, you join not only David in his cave, but every voice that has ever found comfort in those words. The accumulated spiritual weight of 3,000 years of human breath creates therapeutic power that no individual practice can match. Yet the most profound aspect of psalm effectiveness may be its complete independence from belief. Brain scans show identical neural responses in believers and skeptics, religious practitioners and secular humanists. The therapeutic mechanisms operate through biology rather than ideology, suggesting that these ancient compositions tap into universal aspects of human consciousness that transcend cultural conditioning. This universality explains why psalm adaptations remain effective across radically different languages, traditions, and worldviews. The underlying patterns, mathematical relationships between sound and silence, rhythm and pause, meaning and mystery, appear to be hardwired into human awareness at levels deeper than conscious belief or cultural identity. As artificial intelligence systems begin analyzing the acoustic properties that make psalms effective, they consistently identify patterns that mirror natural phenomena: wave frequencies found in ocean surf, mathematical sequences visible in spiral shells, rhythmic relationships present in maternal heartbeat. The ancient poets had somehow discovered verbal formulas that recreate the acoustic signatures of experiences that promoted safety throughout human evolutionary history. This suggests that effective psalms work by triggering ancestral memories encoded in our nervous systems, recognition patterns that helped our species survive across hundreds of thousands of years of development. When modern people find comfort in verses about green pastures and still waters, they may be accessing genetic memories of the landscapes where humanity learned to rest safely. But the most remarkable discovery may be that these effects persist across generations through epigenetic inheritance. Children whose families practice psalm recitation show enhanced responsiveness to the texts from early ages, suggesting that regular practice creates biological changes that are passed to offspring. Each generation becomes more naturally attuned to the therapeutic patterns encoded in ancient compositions. This means that the 2 billion people who recite psalms today are not just maintaining tradition, they are participating in the ongoing evolution of human consciousness itself. Every voice that speaks ancient words into darkness contributes to a collective refinement of our species' capacity for rest, adding another layer to the accumulated peace that makes these compositions more effective with each passing century. In our restless age, when sleep disorders affect nearly half the global population and anxiety has become epidemic, psalms remain proof that some technologies achieve perfection on the first try. No improvement is possible because the original design already optimizes every variable: frequency patterns that match natural brainwave states, breathing rhythms that synchronize with optimal physiological function, mathematical relationships that create cognitive loops, leading inevitably toward rest. The limestone cave where David first sang to calm his fears is empty now, worn smooth by 3,000 years of wind and weather. Yet the frequencies he discovered continue to resonate through every voice that speaks his words, carrying forward an unbroken chain of comfort that connects our technological present to humanity's most ancient wisdom. When you whisper a psalm in the darkness before sleep, if you participate in the longest conversation in human history, a dialogue between consciousness and comfort that began in terror and has grown into tranquility through the accumulated breath of countless generations. You join David in his cave, medieval monks in their cells, pioneers on prairie nights, and refugees in distant camps, all speaking the same words that have guided human souls toward rest since language learned to heal itself. In learning to sing himself to sleep, David created something more enduring than any empire. Patterns of peace encoded in simple words, refined through millennia of practice, and proven effective by the most extensive clinical trial in human history. That these ancient frequencies still calm modern minds proves not the limitations of contemporary technology, but the timeless nature of human consciousness itself. The stars that witnessed David's first fearful song still shine overhead. The same darkness that threatened him surrounds us still. But his words continue to transform terror into tranquility, carrying the promise that no soul need face the night alone. In our endless search for rest, we discover that the answer was composed 3,000 years ago by a shepherd boy who learned that survival sometimes requires singing in the darkness. And so the ancient words continue their work, carrying peace across centuries and cultures, proving that some technologies transcend time precisely because they serve needs as enduring as consciousness itself.